Oh, of course, about GPT
Uh-huh.
or AI, right? Do they have consciousness? Can they have consciousness?
And in the case of LLMs, your answer is?
So LLMs, the quick answer is no, they don't have consciousness. The reason is that, so LLMs learn the causal relations between words. You can say that, each word has some causal power of other words, right? And the context and the sentences, and there are the grammatic rules. So GPT and LLMs they need to learn these causal relations. And theoretically, they might create a simulation of those causal relations. So we are in a good direction, right? I mean, it met at least two conditions to have consciousness. You have the cognitive system, and it created the simulation. But then what about the two others? They don't really have any simulation of themselves inside, and they don't have any affective balance, just because this is not how they function, this is not how they work. They don't use affective balance, and they don't have any representation of themselves inside the simulation. We don't even know if they have a simulation, let's say. I remember reading a paper 2 years ago, I think, that showed that if you take LLMs, they sound very intelligent. They sound that they have understanding, But then if you change enough the problem, they will stuck. So they don't really understand all the relations, all the causal relations, all the structure, all the causal structure underlying the question and the problem. If they would understand it, then they will not stuck. They will know what to do in order, to cope with the changes that you did in the question. But for now, at least, they stuck. So it means that maybe they don't even have a simulation, But even if they do, they don't have any simulation of themselves and any affective balance. So that's why they cannot create this what is it likeness physical property. So they don't have, but of course that in principle, we can create AIs with consciousness. We know what to do, right? We know now all those 4 conditions. So if they will meet them, they will have consciousness as well. They will have something that is like very rudimentary, maybe in the beginning, but then they will continue to learn, and they will create much more elaborate consciousness, just like us. So in principle, we can do it. It's a bit like what we see in sci-fi movies, right? In principle, now we can take your brain or the audience brain, understand the dynamics over there, mimic the same simulation that is created in their brain, but do it now in a computer. So if it's exactly the same simulation, then again, inside the simulation, we'll have the exact same variables that simulate affective balance and that simulate the system itself. So then, the frame of reference of the simulated system will have consciousness, right? It will have the same exact physical properties that will be manifest there. One of them is this: what is it like? Is it good or bad for me? With all all the simulation, with all the relational, all those causal relations, And in the end of the day, we will get the same simulation with the same properties, with the same phenomenal properties as well. And then we actually copied ourselves and our consciousness into a computer.
Nir, I have so many more questions for you. I have to get going soon. So I have to choose my questions carefully. There will very likely be a part 2. So if you're watching this, then please leave a comment for questions for Nir for the second time, because this podcast was more an introduction to the ideas of Nir, and then we can get into even more questions about his particular theory in part 2. But anyhow, what do you make of Chalmers' zombie argument?
Yeah. So the zombie argument, I wrote about it in my first paper. The zombie argument, so maybe let's say quick what is the zombie argument. So maybe first of all, let's state quick what is the argument. Because we saw that phenomenal properties are different, you cannot reduce them to any physical dynamics, then it seems that you can think of a creature, this philosophical zombie, that is identical to me, for example, in its physical shape and all the physics of the brain and all the neuroscience of the brain. Everything is identical to me, identical body as well, but with no consciousness. Again, because it seems that consciousness is just independent from the physical, right? If you don't take into account the principle of relativity. So Chalmers argued that we can think of those zombies, zombies that are exactly like us, but have no consciousness. Now, the thing is that when we take the principle of relativity seriously enough, then zombies cannot exist. Because if you remember do you remember the equivalence principle? It seems like we talked about it so long ago. Time is relative. We can do an equivalence principle here, equivalence principle of consciousness, by saying that the argument of zombies is they are completely the same. They identical physically to us. But then, according to the principle of relativity, if all the measurements that we can do show us that they are identical, then they are really identical. There is an equivalence here. There cannot be an absolute property that will distinguish between them, according to the principle of relativity. And we did all the measurements that we can. Those measurements include everything that you can think of. Measurements of course, what is the behavior of the zombie. Measurement of what is going on inside their brain, the dynamics of their neurons. Measurements of what do they say, what do they report. And we see that it's all the same. This is part of the argument, right? Of the, zombie argument. So there is no way how to distinguish between us and the zombies. And because of that, if we, respect the principle of relativity, it means that they must have consciousness as well, just like us. Because if they will not have consciousness, then the principle of relativity will break, right? Although we measure that they are exactly the same like us, then there is no difference. There actually is a difference. They don't have consciousness. So the principle of relativity would break. So we need to choose. I choose the principle of relativity, right? That this is a principle that is the basic principle in reality. And that's why zombies cannot exist, because we cannot distinguish between us and the zombies. They must have consciousness as well.
Okay, 2 thoughts occur to the listener. One is, you keep saying that consciousness is not an absolute property, it's a relative property. They may be thinking, Nir, are you saying that me, the listener, that I am not conscious, or that my consciousness as the listener depends on someone else's consciousness, and vice versa?
So it depends. Consciousness, yeah, because it's not absolute. It depends. It depends on the frame of reference, right? What we saw is that the frame of reference that manifests consciousness is the simulated cognitive system inside the simulation, right? So the answer for the audience is that inside your simulation, inside, quote, quote, your brain creates a simulation, and in this simulation, there is a frame of reference of the simulated cognitive frame, and then this is where consciousness is manifested. Because as we said before, the simulation, all the causal power of the simulation is the causal power that comes from the variables that create the simulation. And those variables are the external world, but also the simulated cognitive system and affective balance, right? And because of that, now we have physical properties of the outside world and a property of is it good or bad for me? This is the what is it likeness property. And the one that measured this property is exactly the frame of reference of the simulated self, of the simulated cognitive system, inside the simulation. This is the frame that measures the effective balance. Let me remind you. Let's say that I see an apple. I see an apple. What it means is that there is a real apple outside. Light from the apple meets my eyes. It starts all those causal, dynamical, processes. In the end, it will influence the simulation. So now all those variables of the simulation will have all this causal structure of the apple. Part of this causal structure is also affective balance, this variable that state is it good or bad for me, right? So the apple now has this, it's good for me, right? But affective balance, it interacts with the cognitive system. The cognitive system is the one, that get this information. Is it good for me or bad for me? That's why we need to have the cognitive system as part of the simulation. Okay? And in the simulation, this cognitive system get the information from the effective balance. Is it good or bad for me? Get the information about, the apple. So that's why the cognitive system inside the simulation manifests all the relations. So because of all the relations, it manifests all the physical properties of the apple, and also all this, is it good or bad for me? This, what is it likeness for me to have the apple? Okay? So, the answer is that the audience consciousness, your consciousness, comes from your own simulation that your brain created. And that's why from any other frame of reference that is outside of the simulation, we cannot measure it. That's why remember that we spoke about the coin, head and tail. This is exactly why we have the head and tail here. Only in the frame of reference of the cognitive frame, of the cognitive system inside the simulation, only there will be a manifestation of what is it likeness, of the effective balance. Any other frame of reference will not have this. Will measure different relations, and will not have these relations of affective balance, and will not measure this. What is it likeness?
The Economist covers math, physics, philosophy, and AI in a manner that shows how different countries perceive developments and how they impact markets. They recently published a piece on China's new neutrino detector. They cover extending life via mitochondrial transplants, creating an entirely new field of medicine. But it's also not just science. They analyze culture, they analyze finance, economics, business, international affairs across every region. I'm particularly liking their new insider feature. It was just launched this month. It gives me a front row access to The Economist's internal editorial debates, where senior editors argue through the news with world leaders and policymakers in twice weekly long format shows. Basically, an extremely high quality podcast. Something else you should know about is that if you go to their app, they not only have daily articles, but they also have long form podcasts with their editors and writers. This is also available online. Whether it's scientific innovation or shifting global politics, The Economist provides comprehensive coverage beyond headlines. As a TOE listener, you get a special discount. Head over to economist.com/TOE to subscribe. That's economist.com/TOE for your discount.